My favorite preacher, who's now deceased as of around 2015, I heard him speak one time, and they introduced him at a chapel service at our Bible college, and they said he was a treasure to the community of ministers, to preachers. And he came up, and he was an older guy. He came up, a little short old man, and he said, I like being introduced, and I like how polite they were, but when I think of treasure, I think of buried treasure, antiquities and mummies of old. And I'm offended because I also think that's what he was thinking of when he called me that. And that's always stuck with me because that's how I think of Egypt. I mean, my experiences of Egypt are pretty minimal. I've never been there. I could tell you in Hebrew it's Mitzrayim. That makes me feel like I know something about it, but I don't. I've never been. My dad worked with a guy named Che who grew up in Egypt, in Cairo, and he was just a regular old white dude in America. You never would have known that he came from a military family in Egypt, but he did, and he was a great welder and a good guy, and that's pretty much my only connection to Egypt, except Universal Studios' Revenge of the Mummy ride, which is my favorite ride at an amusement park. It's so good. It's the perfect blend of animatronics and fog and lighting and indoor roller coaster in the dark, and then there's fire. I mean, it's all the good stuff packed into one ride. Then they updated it several years back, and now it's even smoother. If you haven't ridden it and you have, what am I saying? If you have a lot of income and you can afford to go to Universal, which most of us can't, but if you could, you should go and you should ride that ride if you don't have pregnancy or heart conditions or any of that. All right. Pregnancy is not a condition. I'm saying if you are not pregnant, nor do you have conditions like heart disease or weak lungs or something. Okay. Where are my notes? The rest of the sermon's going to be less funny, so I'm trying to open up with some humor. When I think of Egypt, truly, I think of mummies, like creepy mummies, and ancient cobweb-covered treasure, and Brendan Fraser, and rides at an amusement park. Like, that's what I associate with Egypt. That is so far removed from the Mitzrayim of the Hebrew Bible, from Egypt as the Israeli people knew it. So far removed that I'm out of touch. The way I feel about some of you when I get frustrated with my Bible teaching and I'm trying to tell you about something that happened in ancient Ephesus, things that I have really studied a lot, and I can tell it's like phew, right over your head. So you're like, I don't care about that. That's how I feel about ancient Egypt. I read the story of Joseph, and a lot of it's like phew, right over my head. So I've gone back and I've tried to study again ancient Egypt, tried to get to know a little more about it. And in order to analyze the Bible's description of that period in Egypt, the time that Joseph was there, we need to first understand when he was there and where he was and what it would have been like. And there are some chronological clues. If we work straight forward, reading 1 Kings and Exodus, we could assume Joseph lived in Egypt around 1800s BC. So we can place him in Egypt at that time. And that corresponds to what we know as the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with Kings Sennacherib II and Sennacherib III, or maybe you know them by their Greek name, Sesostris. And no? Okay. That was supposed to be funny because obviously you don't know all that. Did anybody already know all of that? Maybe I am the dumb one and you just all know a lot about Egypt and I don't. I just know Brendan Fraser. Egyptologist Charles Ayling, Dr. Charles Ayling, he's very important. He offered compelling evidence about historical details of the Bible. I read an article, a journal article this week, and I copied some of the details. I think this is fascinating. Some of you are like, just get to the sermon. But there are going to be 4 sermons on Joseph, and I want to put you historically in the context. And I kind of want to remind you that the Bible is reliable as a document. I'm one who's often willing to admit we don't know who authored certain books. We don't know exactly how those books made it into the canon after the first few hundred years of the church, but eventually they did. I am very honest about the formation and canonization of Scripture. I would say more honest than most preachers in this community. I will be real with you about who wrote what and what we know and what we don't know, and manuscript tradition and errors and little problems we find in the manuscripts. But I will also be the first to admit that the Bible is incredibly accurate in its historical detail, to a point that no other ancient document comes close. It is incredibly accurate, and we have tons of documented evidence. So, some cool things about Middle Kingdom and Egypt. This all lines up with the biblical account of Joseph. The breaking of the independence of the powerful nomarchs under Sennacherib III. That's in Genesis 47. Slavery as an institution of society flourished in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, which of course is part of the Genesis narrative. Then you have the Hieratic Papyrus, which is from the 12th to 13th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, around that same time. And it records a list of the names of slaves, including 30 non-Egyptian names, most of which are identical to biblical Hebrew names. Isn't that wild? And the ones that aren't identical are very close. So we even have documented Hebrew slaves in that period of the 12th and 13th dynasty. Joseph in the story marries Asenath, the daughter of the priest of On, in Genesis 41, where the chief god Re was worshipped. Now, you've probably heard of that, the Egyptian god Re. What you might not know is that he was only the supreme Egyptian deity during the Middle Kingdom. At other times, Hyksos, during the Hyksos period, Set was the king, or the deity that the kings and the people worshipped. So Re versus Set. So they changed gods, basically. They worshipped a different god at different times. And we have documented the exact god that was being worshipped at the time of Joseph across historical documents. It's amazing. We have Egyptian names and titles in the biblical account that are well attested in Egyptian historical documents. So the names in the Bible match up with the names in ancient Egyptian documents. All of that. If Joseph did indeed live and serve during the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, we also wonder, where would he have visited? What would it have looked like? Now, of course, we can't go back in time and see it, but we know throughout history different cities served as the capital of Egypt. The 11th dynasty, they ruled from Thebes. The pharaohs were placed in Thebes. When Amenemhat I came to power and founded the 12th dynasty, he moved the capital to Ijtawi. And Ijtawi was, well, I can't show you a picture of it because it's in ruins, although NASA scientists have found satellite images. Basically, they can see where the Nile River used to route, I think further westward, and they can see the raised ruins where Ijtawi was almost definitely located. It's kind of amazing, but I can't show you pictures of it. However, both the Senusret kings, the second and the third, that are in Genesis, they would have had their burials there. And so I can show you the pyramids. So these are the remnants. Oh, wait, did you show them the ride? Because that was the first picture. There it is in its glory. In the most magical place in the world, Orlando, Florida. The sweaty armpit of America. Okay. Don't forget the mosquitoes. Okay, that is the pyramid of Senusret II. It's not like the pyramids of Giza, okay? I don't want you to get your hopes up. It's not quite that grand, but it is still remarkable. And Joseph would have attended the funeral procession when this king was laid to rest in that pyramid. Now, that's cool to think about. That's 4,000 years ago, right? And then the next one is Senusret III's pyramid, which is in a little bit better shape. It at least looks a little pointier, which is what I think of as a pyramid. And that's in Dashur. So try to envision yourself in the story, right? As we study Joseph, I don't want you to think modern Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat productions, right? I want us to imagine we're in Mitzrayim, we're in ancient Egypt, and we're going to experience times of plenty and times of famine, and there are kings who have monarchical power from the gods themselves. It's a different world that Joseph lives in, and I want to place ourselves there. But I also want to get to the point because Neil told a nice story, and we started a few minutes late, so I'm going to try to hurry up, okay? How many of you have plans after church? Like everybody, right? Some of you are like, no, we'll be here all day. That's fine. I won't, so we've got to move along. Week 1, the first week of this series, I'm calling each one the blank and the blank. So this one's the dreamer in the pit. And then the next 3 weeks we'll have catchy titles like that, okay? This one's the dreamer in the pit. Joseph. You know about Joseph, right? At least that he had a Technicolor Dreamcoat. You at least know that, or you have heard of it. And he did kind of. He had a long-sleeved garment, which is disappointingly not quite a multicolored garment, which is what we think the word would be. That's a King James thing, right? The actual term would just be like a long robe with long sleeves. But it was a sign of authority. So he's the beloved, exalted son of Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, if we assume Benjamin's already born at this point. He had 6 sons by Leah, the one Jacob was tricked by, that Laban, his father-in-law, got Jacob to marry Leah instead of Rachel, his beloved, and then he had to work another 7 years and then earn Rachel's hand in marriage. It's a whole crazy story. He had 2 sons each by the maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah, and then lastly, he had Joseph and Benjamin with Rachel, his beloved wife. He had the other wife that apparently was not as beloved, and that's also a hard thing to read about. Joseph is the oldest of the sons of Rachel. but he's still much younger than all the other brothers. And Jacob favors Joseph more than his brothers. The Bible doesn't shy away from that, which, again, is frustrating when you read it. It doesn't care to tell us that Jacob favored one wife over the other. It doesn't care to tell us that he favored one son over the others. God does not play favorites, but people do, and Jacob did. I think he still loved all of his children, certainly, but he favored Joseph. And I don't think that's okay. So Joseph's story starts with me raising a question. Why would you let your kids know that you like one kid more than the rest of them? And in what world do you think that's going to turn out well for the kid that you really like? It's not a good idea. If you have a favorite kid, you who are here this morning, don't tell the other kids that that's your favorite kid. It's just not a good practice. Jacob signals Joseph's favored role in the family when he gives him that special robe, right? A long robe with sleeves, or as King James says, a coat of many colors. And Dolly Parton, is that who sings about that? Oh, something like that popped into my head, so it must be real. I trust my memories as much as I trust Google, which is not a lot. Honestly, this is a difficult phrase to translate, but I will tell you what we know about this robe is that its usage, the term for it, refers to special authority. Okay? It wasn't just colorful. It meant that Joseph would be the heir to Jacob's family lineage. Not his older brothers, which would have the rightful place, but Joseph was being trained to manage the estate. All the sheep and any kind of grain that they might have grown and whatever else they did, Joseph would have become the guy in charge when his father died. That's radically unusual in the ancient Near East. Normally, the oldest son would reserve that right, but Joseph is the oldest son. He's just the oldest son of the wife Jacob really loved. And so he will earn that right instead of all these older brothers by other women that are not the beloved wife. It's a messy story. So maybe we should just start, this isn't in my notes, but maybe we should start by acknowledging that the stories in the Bible are not examples to follow, unless it's Jesus, right? The Gospels are examples to follow with Jesus. But the Old Testament stories are usually not examples to follow. They're examples of what not to do. Almost always, they are examples of what you should not do. So be careful how you read the Old Testament. Jacob does this. He plays favorites with one son. The other sons get mad. And this introduces a theme that's going to come up again and again in Joseph's story. Clothing being connected with his authority. That is an ancient Near East custom. So you're going to see clothing and authority tied together throughout his story. When he's robed and when his robes are stripped away, it is deeply symbolic of his position and authority being stripped away from him by those who are jealous. Joseph is then the beloved son. He's treated as the heir of the house. He reports directly to his father. He's trained in administering the family business. And that explains why he's not always out in the field with his brothers. Because I've heard some preachers who don't know ancient Near East context very well, they'll get up here and say, Joseph was lazy. He didn't help his brothers in the field. No wonder they hated him. Or Joseph was a wimpy mama's boy, and that's why he never went out and worked. And that's just not the case. Joseph was learning administration. He was shadowing his father to later manage the family business. His brothers were doing the grunt work. He was going to be upper management. That's the better picture that we see here. Not that that makes it any better for his brothers. If anything, it might make it worse. I think I could deal with a lazy little brother much easier than I could an arrogant one who's going to try to rule over me. And that's where the story's going. So I want to get into Genesis chapter 37. We find Joseph not just in a pit, but first dreaming. Before he's ever thrown into a pit, he's a dreamer. And I want to understand Joseph the dreamer. Chapter 37, beginning in verse 5. We're going to read through verse 11. And I think I've put all the scriptures on the screen today. We'll see what happens. Genesis 37, verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I've dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, that's so cool. No, I'm sorry. They said, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Notice it's not just the dreams. It's that he's willing to say it out loud. It's the words that you would think having that dream, you should tell us about it. You don't think it's going to make them mad? Verse 9, then he dreamed another dream and told, that made me think of Les Mis. And he told it to his brother. What is up with the Broadway references today? He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his own father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you've dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Another way you might translate this, his father retained his judgment or held back his judgment. So he was still going to think about it. The brothers are quick to judge and become jealous, of course. So Joseph has two dreams. First, he tells his brothers about a dream where they're binding wheat in the field. His brother sheaves all bow down to his, okay? And everyone rightly assumes the truth of these dreams, and they get angry and say, "So you're going to be in charge of us. We're going to bow down to you." And they hate him even more. Then he has the next dream, and he tells this one to his parents and his brothers, or at least to his father. And now it's the sun and the moon. That's his father and his mother, and then the 11 stars are the other children. And he's saying the whole family's going to bow down to me one day. And even Jacob resists that at first and says, "Excuse me? Me, the one training you to take over, I'm going to bow to you? I don't know about that." And so he rebukes Joseph, and then he continues to think on it. The brothers instantly become all the more jealous and filled with hate. At this point, we see mounting tension in the story already in chapter 37. The story goes all the way to chapter 50. We're not going to read all of it. Even over the next 4 weeks, we'll just read bits and pieces and talk about it. But already there's a lot of tension. Joseph is exalted. He's beloved. He's favored. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. It's there. There's favoritism. I do think it's wrong, but that's up for your interpretation. I think it's wrong, but whatever it is, it's there, and they have to deal with it. Okay, Joseph is the favorite. And he's received this special position, and God has given him dreams about his future, that he will rule over his family, they will bow down to him. And we often remember that following God involves persecution and suffering. We know the rest of Joseph's story. He's going to suffer. But we need to start that difficult journey knowing that our dreams and ambitions, our hopes for the future, might actually be aligned with God's plan. And this is the part of Joseph's story I don't usually stop and think about. I assume he was just a jerk, and he liked to rub it in his brothers' faces. But it's not exactly true, is it? When he goes out and checks on his brothers to report back to their dad, he's just doing his job. When he has dreams from God and shares them with his family, he's simply sharing the dreams that God has given him. And who gave them those dreams? God. God did. They're not bad dreams. So he's not doing anything inherently wrong. I do think that Joseph is a human, like the rest of us. So I think there's got to be some struggles there in his personality. But I really don't see him as a villain here. I think he's just sharing these dreams. And we assume if someone has a dream that they will be a leader, that they are automatically or inherently arrogant and cocky, and that they shouldn't be a leader. And yet that proves the opposite for Joseph. Joseph has dreams of being a leader, and he will later be a leader. And he will not just lead, he will effectively save thousands of lives. And it's all part of God's plan. I say this because perhaps some of you are meant to be leaders. And maybe God has given you hopes or dreams about how to step up in your life and do good for others, how to help them, maybe even to save them. And you think, ooh, I don't want to be cocky. I don't want to come across arrogant. And so you refrain, you hold back, you don't ever step up and lead. And so then we have a whole bunch of followers with very few faithful leaders. I think that's part of the problem in the church. It's not that we have too many chiefs and not enough Indians. It's that we have all Indians who are afraid for anyone to say they want to be a chief. And that's probably a politically incorrect analogy, and I shouldn't use it. Although my family came from a reservation, so I think I'm allowed to say that, right? I'm going to cut all of that out of the YouTube video. I am serious, though. I think our dreams are often aligned with God's plan, that he gives vision. God says that. Jeremiah 29:11. God made promises to Israel throughout their history, and this is a promise to all of Israel through the prophet. I know the plans I have for you, God has declared, the Lord declares, plans for welfare, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. A future and a hope. A future and a hope. What is a future and a hope if it's not dreams and ambitions? That's what future and hope is. We need future hope to propel us forward when things become difficult. Even if your dream isn't to be a leader, certainly we share the dream of God doing great and wonderful and good things in the world around us, often through our help, with our help, working through us. If that's the goal, is to bring heaven to earth, as Jesus taught us to pray, then that dream should propel us forward. We shouldn't be afraid of it. It is God's plan that the world be joined back to heaven and that God dwell with the people he created. That's the story of Revelation. God comes to dwell in the New Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven. It's this magnificent picture of God and people reunited, and he says there won't be any crying, mourning, or death, or pain, no more sin, or sickness, or sadness. Everything will be made new. If that's the vision, and we all have that vision, then that vision should carry us forward every day. That dream, that alignment with God's ultimate will should be a propelling force in our lives. But many of us are too caught up in the day-to-day grind to even think about that vision. Or maybe we don't really believe it. Maybe we're not convinced that God will bring it to pass. Either way, we don't live out of that vision. And I'm going to read another scripture, Proverbs 29:18, where there is no prophetic vision, meaning no future hope, people cast off restraint. And I see that all around me. If you have no goal, no hope, no ambition for what will come, then now is all that matters. And people live like this every day. It's a scary thought how much of this has infiltrated the church. We need a vision of God's promised future. That's why we talk so much about the world to come, why we sing about it, why we preach about it, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, because it is the goal. It is the prophetic vision for all of God's people. So I think God may give you individual visions or hopes or dreams, but I think collectively he's given us all one shared vision of a world where God is king and people do as they ought to do for one another, where we love God and we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. That dream, that future hope, and I know it's not fully realized yet, but that hope should propel everything you say and do, especially when things become difficult. And that's what's going to happen for Joseph. He needs these dreams of what will come because of what's about to come to pass. He needs help to endure. And I just wonder, what does your hope look like? Because you have difficulties, don't you, in your life? Problems, struggles. Where is your hope? What propels you forward? What helps push you through those difficult times? Where do you find your endurance? The world is full of scary stuff. Where do you turn for future hope? I hope, no pun intended, I hope that it's to God, to his vision for the future. The second point, beyond the dreams of Joseph, is the betrayal and suffering that ensues. So I want to continue verse 18 through 28. Genesis 37, verses 18 through 28. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, this is Joseph going to check on his brothers for his father, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits." The pit would be a water cistern that's dried up. So throw him into an old cistern. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So we have one brother that wants to help. They're not all rotten. Verse 23, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe that has, it says of many colors, but as I told you, the long-sleeved robe, the robe that showed his power and authority. They took it off of him, and they threw him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. We'll mention that later. They took Joseph to Egypt. And not to ride the Revenge of the Mummy either. At this point in the story, Jacob shows us that he really doesn't understand what's going on with the other sons. I don't think he believes that Joseph is in this much inherent danger. The other sons have taken the flock quite a few days' journey from home to pasture them, and to get an update, Jacob sends his right-hand man Joseph, his beloved son, to check on them, and after being redirected to their location, the brothers see Joseph at a distance, and they plot. And they don't just plot, they plot how to kill him. And if it weren't for Reuben, they would have killed him. They thought, we'll say a wild animal killed him. We'll bring back his bloody coat and hand it to our dad, and dad will never know what we did. This is some pretty evil stuff. Only Reuben cautions against the murder, the oldest of the brothers, the firstborn of Leah, the only one who has a right to truly be angry with Joseph for taking his birthright position, because he's the oldest, even though he's not Rachel's oldest, he's technically the oldest son of Jacob. And he's the one that says, maybe we should just leave him there, and then later I could come back and save him. The brothers agree. They strip him of his robe. They throw him into a pit. And then comes the most heart-wrenching line in the whole chapter, maybe in the whole book of Genesis. They sat down to eat. How dark is that? Their brother right there screaming out to them in a pit. Probably broke his leg on the way in or something, and he's screaming and crying out for help. And it says they heard his cries. It tells us that later. They heard his cries, and they didn't care. They just had dinner. That kind of hatred, it's hard to imagine. Maybe it's not hard for you to imagine, I don't know. But this calloused indifference, the lack of remorse, the apathy. Think of how audacious it is to sit down and eat, to serve yourself a meal, while closing your ears to your own brother's cries. And if, like me, you've spent most of your Christian life finding yourself sympathizing with Joseph, then may I encourage you to think differently at this moment in the story. Maybe we're not only like Joseph, but at times we're more like his brothers. How often I've sat down in luxury while people around me cry out for help. How often I've sat down and fed myself when hungry people surround me in this world. I imagine you've done the same. It's easy to judge these brothers, but Jesus said that we are all brothers and sisters. And for every person we ignore, it's Jesus himself that we've ignored. Now think about that this week. I won't stop there because that's a little too heavy-handed, but I will say, God have mercy on us. I also think about Romans 8:28, and so that's the good news, that God works all these things together for good, for all those who are called according to his purpose. I love that verse. I used to love it because I thought it meant whatever happens to me, God's going to turn it into good for me. But it doesn't say for me. Reread it. All things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. That doesn't mean it's going to work out good for me. Now, ultimately, everything will work out good for every person who loves Jesus, right? In the big picture. But the little bad things that happen to me may not work out to little good things for me later. You think about that. Sometimes the difficult things I face, the problems, the suffering, even unfair suffering, is actually there to help someone else who's been called according to God's purpose. And that's a little more selfless to think about, and I don't know that I like it. I'd rather think that it's all going to be good for me. But Jesus would say, it's not about you. That's the whole point. Perhaps my willingness to suffer, to be in a pit, could save other people from their pits, from their dried up cisterns. The brothers refused to suffer any longer under Joseph's leadership, so they threw their own brother into a hole, and they eventually sold him off to be a slave to the Midianites. And yet Joseph's suffering will lead to the saving of many lives. He believed in the visions God had given him of a better future, one full of blessing, one of salvation. It's a hope. It's a dream. But it's enough to keep Joseph going a little bit longer. I wonder if you have that kind of hope. Can you trust God when you're in the pit? Genesis 39, verse 1 says, "Meanwhile, the Ishmaelites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard," which is where we're going to pick up the story next week. in the house of Potiphar. But I want you to understand that Joseph's story just keeps on going, and it doesn't get much easier, at least not right away. He's going to keep suffering. He's going to remain in a pit. Even though they pull him out of the pit, his life is in a metaphorical pit for quite a while. And that's something I've had to think about too. The pit in ancient Near East cosmology is the word for the grave, Sheol. It's the word for death. And I think it's metaphorically a word for anyone who feels trapped and lost and hopeless, who can't get themselves out. That's a pit. It feels like dying, even if you're not literally dying. In fact, it's often something else besides dying, but being in a pit is being in a pit. And some of you know what it feels like to be in a pit, don't you? You've been there. Some of you are there right now. You're only here this morning because you are so desperate to get out of whatever pit you're in. And you've come to hear from God if there's some way out. And God says, yes, but maybe not yet. And I don't want to hear that. And I know you don't want to hear that. I imagine chronic illness, whether physical or mental, feels like a pit that you can't just climb out of. Maybe you know the pain of feeling trapped. Abusive relationships probably feel like a pit that you just cannot get out of. And plenty of other examples that you have in this room. Some of you are in a pit. I know that. God knows that. And I know it's hard to do, but you have to learn to trust that God is in control, like Neil told us, even when circumstances seem to say otherwise. When things are grim, you cannot give up on the dreams that God has given you, especially when you find yourself in a pit. That's when you most need to trust that God will do what he said he will do. Whether you're enslaved or mistreated or misunderstood, God does not leave you, God does not abandon you, God will not forsake you. And God never fails to keep his promises. Would you stand with me as we close? Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. How many of you have heard that before? It's a pretty famous Bible verse or verses. It's good. It's one of those, it's like a bumper sticker that nobody really does or believes. It's just one of those really nice sounding things in the Bible, and then people don't actually do it. I want you to think about what it would look like in your life, whether or not you're in a pit right now, but especially if you are. What would it look like to trust the Lord with all your heart and not to lean on your own understanding of what's happening? To trust God in all your ways, to acknowledge him, which we're going to see Joseph will do again and again. And then know that God will make your path straight. What does that look like for you this week? What does it look like for you in the big scheme of life, with the trajectory of your life? To trust God and not your own understanding. Joseph's story is a story of trust and patience. It's also a story that points to another. I'd be remiss not to mention Jesus in these sermons, and so I have to. Because Joseph's story has so many parallels with the story of Jesus in the Gospels. First of all, the obvious one today is that Judah, by the way, Judas is just another spelling of Judah. So Judas, the apostle of Jesus, is a namesake of Judah, the son of Jacob. He also sells his brother, his close friend Jesus, for 30 pieces of silver, which is close enough to 20 shekels. We'll call it inflation. You know, it's like 1,800 years later. So inflation was probably a lot higher than that. But either way, that's, if anything, it just makes it all the sadder that Joseph was worth more than Jesus. That's crazy to think about. It's even crazier to think that someone who thought Jesus a brother would sell him for a bag of silver. But then again, Judah sells his brother for a bag of silver, and that's his own blood, flesh and blood. It doesn't matter. When you're angry and jealous and hurting, you will do things that you never dreamed you would do to people that you never thought you would hurt. And some of you will nod in agreement because you've done it, and some of you will pretend you haven't. Jesus is the special object of his Father's love, just as Joseph is the favored son of Jacob. Jesus has promises of divine exaltation. More than that, he has the realization of it. even glimpses of it at his transfiguration. And then he comes back down from the mountain and says, how much longer am I to be with you, twisted and faithless generation? He gave up the dream and postponed it. He didn't give it up, but he postponed it in order to do what he had to do to save many lives. He was mocked by his own family and friends. He was stripped of his robe and his divine power. And of course, he was delivered over to Gentiles, like the Midianites and Ishmaelites in the story of Joseph. And those are just some of the parallels. We're going to have more parallels every week as we study Joseph's story, because Joseph points us to Jesus. I think Joseph is his own man and has his own important story, but we can't help but see the parallels because God wants you to see this is what humans do to one another. But look at what God does through it and beyond it. The end of Joseph's story, he says, what you intended for evil, God used for good. Well, isn't that what Paul said in Romans 8? That God will work all things together for good for those who are called according to his purpose? That hasn't changed. That's who God is. He's a God who takes the ugly human crap that we live in and we perform and do and create, and he makes beautiful things out of it. He takes all the junk of your life and he restores it and makes it lovely. And only God can do that. And he promised to do it and has given you the dream that it will come to pass. So when things are difficult, hold on to hope because you know the future that's in store for you. And today, if you were in a pit like Joseph or hanging on a cross like Jesus or whatever metaphor you want to apply to your situation, you must trust God that he's good and faithful and true. And he will never fail you. That this morning, if you heard this sermon and you thought, I don't think I'm really in a pit right now. Like life's pretty, like for me at this moment, I'll be really transparent. My life is going very well at this moment. I've been through some pit experiences, but right now my life is really great. And some of that is because of you, so thank you. But I'll be honest, that's when I have to be the brother who's willing to speak up and rescue my friend out of the pit. Just because I'm not being thrown in the pit doesn't mean I get to sit down and have a meal. So if you're in the pit, today's an encouragement to hold fast to the truth God has given you, that he will save you, he will rescue you, he will keep you. He'll never fail you or forsake you. But if you're the one that's watching people in the pit, let this be an encouragement to you to do something about it. Do not sit and eat your meal while people cry out in hunger and need. Do something to help. So whoever you are, there's something for you to do today, this week.